hapa 750 tunafaa kwa. It is the last day of May 2024. Rise and shine to the morning momentum. Your daily dose of a comprehensive rundown of the top stories making the headlines. Use the hashtag The Morning Momentum at Younib Media TV at Alfonsoh Albakwekwe. Let's take a look at the top stories on the Standard this morning. Ruto Husler jet top flies into Crosswinds. Tough questions are being asked after the president claimed the luxury aeroplane he used for the state visit to the US was paid for by his friends. Who are these friends? What was their interest in the trip? And was the law breached in entering into such a deal? Why was KQ dragged into the matter earlier? Those are the questions you want answered on page 4 of the Standard this morning. Let's take a look at page 5. Millions splashed in UDA polls. On page 3, family says Kirui body will remain on Mount Everest. And lastly, on page 6, Duale, keep off military choppers. Defense CS Aden Duale has announced that the military helicopters will no longer be available for use by politicians to limit their misuse. Also on page 6, pass the NADCO report without editing, says Azimio. On national news, page 10, politicians in funds plea ahead of Madaraka. The president landed in Bungoma to preside over tomorrow's Madaraka Day with the local politicians calling for revival of the sugar industry and equity in the disbursement of development funds. That's a top story making the headlines on page 10. Now let's take a look at page 2. Ruto Gachagua avoid infighting claims during city prayer event. The DP has been the subject of unprecedented attacks from the president's allies. Ruto's silence has been interpreted by observers as an endorsement of the attacks. That is a top story you want to catch up with on page 22. On page 2, sorry. On page 3 of the Standard this morning, family climber's body to be left on Mount Everest. Kirui's family says mission to retrieve body is too risky. The cost too, estimated at 24.7 million shillings, is exorbitant. Now, the body of a Kenyan climber who died on Mount Everest last week will remain on the mountain where he died, his family has said. Joshua Cheruiyot Kirui died while on a daring mission to reach the summit of Mount Everest without supplementary oxygen. That's a top story making the headlines on page 3. Let's take a look at page 4. Playing mind games. Ruto now says friends paid for the 200 million shillings jet. The president earlier said he chose the luxurious jet because it was cheaper than the Kenya Airways. Now he says his friends paid for the 200 million shillings jet because they couldn't let him fly commercial. Now, he said yesterday in the prayer breakfast meeting, and I quote, "I am very responsible steward. Believe you me, there is no way I can spend 200 million shillings, end of quote." Now, on the other hand, Professor Gitile Naituli says, he told us, and I'm quoting, he told us that he had paid for the private jet because it was cheaper than KQ. Where have the friends come from now? Those are the many questions people are asking. Edwin Sifuna, Nairobi Senator, said, and I quote, "The president is obviously lying after being cornered by hawk-eyed journalism by Emmanuel To of KTN." Also, Jimmy Wanjigi said, and I quote, "He must comply with Section 14 of the Leadership and Integrity Act," end of quote. More of those insights on page 4 of the Standard this morning. On page 5, UDA candidates pamper delegates ahead of polls. Now, representatives being pampered in posh city hotels ahead of constituency polls today. Big names to battle it out as National Elections Board chairman warns errant leaders. That's the top story making the headlines on page 5. Now, let's take a look at page 6. Aden Duale, the CS for Defense, now bans politicians from using Defense Forces choppers. Defense CS says unregulated use of military aircraft has forced key security operations to use faulty aircraft. Directive part of Kenya Defense Forces' ongoing efforts to safeguard its resources from non-military utilization. He said, and I quote, "We have a policy. We are not going to carry politicians anymore. Helicopters are meant for specific functions within KDF. They are part of our assets in safeguarding the country," end of quote. That is CS Aden Duale. Now, let's take a look at page 8. Administrators get powers to monitor education standards. The national government administrative officers across the country will have additional mandate of ensuring education standards are prompted within their jurisdictions. That is in Bungoma County. In other stories, EU wants Kenya to give nod for trial of Houthi rebels locally. The EU ambassador says the threat by the Yemen rebels was a new one, which called for the bloc to sign a new deal with Kenya to try the suspects. If Kenya okays the agreement, it will not just be home to courts trying the suspects and traffickers, but will also be the dropping point of seized arms and drugs confiscated in the region. That's a top story on page 8. Now, let us take a look at page 10 of the Standard this morning. Ruto begins tour of Western as leaders cite bias in funds sharing. President Ruto will come face-to-face with the sugarcane farmers who have raised concerns about the plan to lease state-owned sugar factories. Leaders claim Kikuyu constituency got 1.2 billion shillings for roads, which was more than combined allocation for Busia, Vihiga, Kakamega, Bungoma, and Trans Nzoia counties. You want to catch up with more of those insights on page 10. On page 11, firing senior executive over warm handshakes costs NGO 6.4 million shillings. Now, Plan International Kenya sacked Nicodemus Kenga on claims of harassment of 2 female employees. Judge noted the NGO should have put the claims in context by having Kenga and his accusers on the same table. That's a top story on page 11. Let's move on and take a look at the expert opinion this morning. The turbulence in President Ruto's U.S. travel just got worse, could crash land. Now, for a man who has been on the move ceaselessly, President Bill Ruto cut a clean and sharp figure on Thursday morning when he appeared at the annual National Prayer Breakfast. He wasn't haggard or jet-lagged after his grueling trips overseas. I suppose that's what happens when one travels in the comfort of a luxury Husler jet. That expert opinion is beefed up for you on page 13. Also, gift from a stranger keen on supporting our boy child to replace the usual gangsters. It's all about the wheeled passenger. You want to catch up with that on page 13. Now, the big question this morning on the Standard, do you support bid to change names of 10 counties? Faith Maingi, youth mentor, says yes, it will promote national cohesion. On the contrary, Kubai Kihara, team lead, PeaceNet, says names are not to blame for discrimination. Now, that's expert opinion. Let's move on and take a look at the pearls, or all the lovers for pearls. You have the article beefed up for you on the Standard this morning. Now, let's take a look at page 18. Judiciary budget cut is a threat to justice, says Chief Justice. Koome said they had asked to be allocated 44 billion shillings, but were given only 22 billion shillings. She said the judiciary should not be the sole forum for resolving disputes. That story is beefed up for you on page 18. Let's now shift gears and take a look at the business news on the Standard this morning. Kenya records improvements in budget transparency utilization. New survey shows more Kenyans become aware of how the government collects and uses revenue. The country's legal framework for public participation also remains solid. That is a top story on page 19. On matters earnings, tea, horticulture lift Kenyan exports past 1 trillion shillings mark. Now, Kenya's total export revenue has hit a historic 1 trillion mark on the back of increased tea, horticulture, salt, plastering material, lime, cement, fertilizers, and meat export revenue. That story on page 19. In matters taxation, captains of industry raise concerns over proposed tax hikes. Chief executives of various industries have voiced their concerns about Finance Bill 2024 that has sparked anger, particularly among consumers and businesses. That is also beefed up for you on page 19. Now, let's take a look at the international scene. South Africa tallies the vote with ANC majority hanging on the line. With just over 10% of votes tallied, the ANC is leading, but with a score of 42%. If President Ramaphosa's party drops below 50%, it will force him to seek coalition partners. That is a top story on page 22. Now, let's take a look at briefly Dodoma, Tanzania needs $378 million for repair. Tanzania needs more than $378.4 million to renovate roads and bridges damaged by El Nino influenced heavy rains, a cabinet minister has said. Brilliant. Let's take a look at Yaoundé. United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees said on Tuesday it is facing a funding shortfall to address the humanitarian needs of Sudanese refugees in Chad. Nearly 185,000 Sudanese have crossed the border into Chad and continue to await relocation from dangerous border areas, particularly in the Adre border town of the Central African country. That is UNHCR report. Let's take a look at Burkina Faso. Lawyer taken up after release. A celebrated lawyer and civil society leader was kidnapped just hours after being freed from prison, his movement said. Kidnappings of people considered hostile to West African nations' military government have taken place. Let's go to Hague. 4 arrested in anti-malware OP. Authorities arrested 4 people and took down or disrupted more than 100 servers in the largest ever operation against botnets that deploy ransomware, Europol said on Thursday. Dubbed Operation Endgame, the sweep was initiated and led by France, Germany, and the Netherlands, with a French official saying they wanted to act before this summer's Paris Olympics. That is a top story making the headlines on page 22. Now, from Hague to the field, let's take a look at sports news on the Standard this morning. We start with tennis. It's one step at a time for Sabalenka. Ariana is aiming to become the second women's player to win Australian Open and French Open in the same season. World number 2 fired 27 winners past Japanese qualifier Moyuka Uchijima to win 6-2, 6-2. Now, in matters tennis, still French Open brings in alcohol ban to stop unruly behavior. The French Open has stopped fans drinking alcohol in the stands in a bid to end unruly behavior, says tournament director Amélie Mauresmo. Let's take a look at page 30. It's all about KO, knockout blow, as no Kenyan boxer will fight at the Olympics. All Kenyans boxers failed in their last bid to book Paris tickets at World Olympic qualifiers. It is same old story for local boxers who also failed at Africa Olympic qualifiers and World event in Italy. That is a top story making the headlines on page 30. On page 31, crunch moment as Shujaa chase World Sevens Series ticket. Kenya must win today's promotion playoffs matches to return to the main event next season. The national sevens team are in group alongside Samoa, Spain, and Chile. That is a top story making the headlines on page 31. On the cover page of the Standard this morning, this is how we'll stop Real Madrid. Madrid, who eliminated Bayern in the semi-finals, stand in the way. Hamel's 35 and 34-year-old Rius face an uncertain future. Now, 11 years after her heartbreaking Champions League final loss to arch rivals Bayern Munich, Borussia Dortmund veterans Mats Hummels and Marco Reus are returning to Wembley tomorrow to set things right. Now, with that story of Real Madrid. We take a quick break and then we come back with the top stories making the headlines on the Daily Nation. Don't go away. See you on the other side of this broadcast. Welcome back to the Morning Momentum. If you are just joining us, you are still rolling with the host with the most. Alfonsoh is my name. Use the hashtag The Morning Momentum at Younib Media TV at Alfonsoh Albakwekwe. Let's take a look at the Daily Nation, the elephant in the room, Husler jet, the Dubai connection, friends with benefits, who paid for this visit and why? Now, as the president reveals Emirati connection in American visit, questions emerge over sweet deal, the need for public disclosures, and how far friends can go in the context of interstate relations. That is a top story on page 4 and page 5 of the Daily Nation this morning. Now, the president says his state visit to the US was co-financed by Friends of Kenya. In other stories, finance experts warn against car and cooking oil taxes. Now, experts have criticized the inclusion of a vehicle tax in the 2024 finance bill, arguing it violates the Constitution. Presenting views to the National Assembly Finance and National Planning Committee, Mr. Ernest Muriu of Ernest and Associates noted that such tax imposition and administration are the preserve of the devolved governments. Now, in numbers, 2.5% is the proposed tax based on the value of the vehicle according to the Finance Bill 2024. Now, in matters arts, inside Eddie Butita's bromance with Ruto, that's a top story beefed up for you on page 3. Let's take a look at page 2 of the Daily Nation this morning. Woman very ill in Saudi Arabia as dream job turns into a nightmare. She now lives in a holding camp and relies on well-wishers for medication and food. After working for only 2 months in the Gulf, her hopes of making it big appear to have been shattered. Now, let's take a look at page 3. Butita, I am Ruto spanner boy on issues to do with creative industry. He has been invited to a number of meetings on matters to do with the creative industry. The comedian burst into the national limelight through the once popular television program, Churchill Show. Now, you want to catch up with that story on page 3 of the Daily Nation this morning. Let's take a look at page 4 and page 5. It's all about the Ruto's trip to the US, who funded the trip and why. Now, storm over luxurious Husler jet, queries over Ruto's gift from his Emirati friends. What do they get in return? President said the Boeing 737-700 jet he flew during the recent trip to the US, operated by Emirati charter airline Royal Jet, cost taxpayers less than 10 million as it was co-sponsored by Friends of Kenya. The questions that remain unanswered, according to the experts, are what the law states about a state officer accepting gifts, who gave the gift, what is the benefit they are getting, and whether the EACC authorized the gift. You want to catch up with that story on page 4 and page 5 of the Daily Nation this morning. Let's take a look at page 6. Ruto calls for calm amid UDA bad blood. The president publicly meets Deputy President Rigathi Gachagua for the first time since 19th of May. The head of state now calls on leaders to work together for a common destiny. That is a top story making the headlines on page 6 of the Daily Nation this morning. Let's take a look at page 8. Proposed vehicle tax is against the law, expert tells House team. Edible oil makers says price will skyrocket due to new taxes and changing policies. Accountant says only county governments can impose such a tax. That is a top story making the headlines on page 8. Let's move on and take a look at page 10. Battle on the ballot, the day of reckoning for MPs in UDA polls. The constituency race is one of the most consequential contests in the party. 144 members are running for constituency chairmanships. That is a top story on page 10. Let's move on and take a look at page 13. Debate on Muguka ban, not new in Mombasa Assembly. 2 coastal counties banned the leaf last week. There was a committee recommendation for total ban in 2019. You want to catch up with more of those insights augmented for you on page 13 of the Daily Nation this morning. Let's move on and take a look at the expert opinion. Now, let science, not emotions, be the core of nicotine debate. The smoke-free products can be offered under medical supervision or through restricted access in strict doses. Those are sentiments by Mercy Korir, and this one is in commemoration of World No Tobacco Day. Also, still other expert opinion, protect minors from tobacco. Tobacco corporations are actively recruiting users. Also, that is an opinion on page 17. On page 19, U.S. support for local journalism is a boost for Kenya's democracy. The U.S. aid package for Kenya announced last week during President William Ruto's state visit to the United States includes support for investigative journalism. This initiative will establish Nairobi as regional hub for public interest journalism. You want to catch up with that opinion on page 19. Now, let's move on to other stories here on the Daily Nation, and that lands us to county news. We start with Elgeyo Marakwet. Broke counties in plea for more money from the CRA. The governor, Rotich, says the county is facing bankruptcy. Commission on Revenue Allocation urged to raise counties' cash to at least 6 billion shillings. It's an appeal that the amount of money to be disbursed to county government be raised to 6 billion shillings. Let's take a look at Nakuru County. 70,000 ECDE learners targeted in free meals program. The county government has launched a school feeding program targeting over 70,000 learners in 2,400 early childhood development and education centers. The 115 million shillings initiative, dubbed Lishe na Mama, aims to increase enrollment, combat malnutrition, and boost educational outcomes for children under 5 years old. Let's take a look at page 24. Trade deal, county set to export textiles to the U.S. Devolved unit is ramping up cotton production to meet demand. According to Wanga, Homa Bay has inked a textiles export deal with the United States. That is a top story making the headlines on page 24 of the Daily Nation. Let us now shift gears and take a look at the international news this morning. Early results in South Africa's election show ANC losing majority. The ruling party could be forced to make a deal with one or more other parties to govern. Poor showing could make Ramaphosa vulnerable to leadership challenge within the party. You want to catch up with more of those insights on page 26. Let's take a look at page 29. Biden plots stay the course strategy after Trump verdict. Daniels threatened to go public with her account over sexual encounter with Donald Trump. Most Trump supporters say the outcome wouldn't make a difference. You want to catch up with that on page 29. Now, let's take a look at business news this morning. Why disputed power bill will not leave you in dark. Consumer relief as sector regulator ups pressure on utility firm. EPRA moves to protect homes and farms from being switched off in case of ROS. Now, briefly in matters investment, EIB invests 3.5 billion shillings in Amethyst Fund. European Investment Bank has invested 25 million euros, an equivalent of 3.5 billion shillings, in Amethyst Fund 3, a Pan-African fund providing private equity growth capital to medium-sized firms on the continent. Now, in matters funding, Safaricom set to start offering loans to startups. Safaricom will for the first time start offering loans to startups via its venture fund, Spark Accelerator, that has been buying stakes in young firms in exchange for cash. Safaricom, in partnership with M-Pesa Africa and Sumitomo Corporation, has announced its next cohort of 9 startups to benefit from the program, which will also provide firms with access to market, technology, and product development in addition to the capital injection. Let's take a look at CSR. Isuzu Longhorn donate books to library named after Kipchoge. Isuzu East Africa, in partnership with Longhorn Publishers, has made a book donation worth 1 million shillings to Kapsisiwa Secondary School Library. The donation was made during unveiling of the science section of the library named after celebrated two-time Olympic marathon champion Eliud Kipchoge, who is the brand ambassador for Isuzu. Now, with that story, we take a look at the sports news on the Daily Nation this morning. All right, let's start it off with rugby. Okello, Kenya Sevens star causing ripples in Japan's rugby. The Women's Kenya Cup winner eyeing Olympic qualification with Kenya Lionesses. Try-scoring machine wins MVP award at JRFU Women's 7 Series and top try scorer gong. Women's Kenya Cup winner eyeing Olympic qualification with Kenya Lionesses. Let's take a look at matters golf. Accountants mark decade of golf excellence at Ruto Club. Huge field drawn for the NCBA Golf Series at the 9-hole Kiambu Golf Club. Field of 250 to tee off in 10th edition of annual tourney that will coincide with the Madaraka Day. That is a top story making the headlines on page 41. Let's move on and take a look at a moment of truth for Kenya Sevens. Kenya fights to gain promotion back to top tier series. Wakati ni sasa for action is now. That is the rallying call from Kenya Sevens captain Vincent Onyala as Kenya heads to make or break World Rugby Sevens series promotion and relegation playoffs starting today in Madrid. On matters football, Dortmund bank on solid defense, quick transitions. Central defenders Hamels and Schottlerback have been in spectacular from the German side in recent months. Bundesliga side play Madrid in Wembley tomorrow. Now, let's take a look at the cover page of the Daily Nation this morning. Kuppet up in arms over welfare cash from its members. Drama as petitioners are barred from attending Union's special National Governing Council meeting. The contested 200 shillings deduction appears on payslips as a social welfare association dues to Kenya Women Teachers Association. Now, with that story of Kuppet, we come to an end of today's session of the Morning Momentum. Thank you so much for choosing to stay with Younib TV, the best youth television network in East and Central Africa. And in a special way, thank you so much for choosing to stay with the Morning Momentum. By extension, all gratitude goes to all those who made this broadcast a success. The Chief Controller, Anifa Kavira, and behind the lens, Raphael Wangila. I have been your host, Alfonsoh. See you on Monday, same time, same place. Do have a beautiful weekend and take care. See you then.